She walked into the towering glass building on her very first day, carrying nothing more than a notebook, a pen, and a silent determination that burned hotter than anyone around her could see. To the executives who glanced her way, she was just another young intern, nervous, eager, and invisible in the grand machinery of power. But what they didn't know was that she carried with her a secret that could shatter their carefully polished world. From the moment she stepped off the elevator, whispers of arrogance floated around her. Snide comments cloaked in laughter. A condescending smile that lingered too long. To them, she was someone they believed they could step over, someone whose worth would always be measured by the color of her skin rather than the brilliance of her mind. But behind that quiet smile and calm presence, there was more strength than they could ever imagine. Every floor she walked across held silent stories of exploitation, of careers destroyed, of voices silenced before they could rise. Yet no one ever questioned the way things were, because questioning power in that building came with consequences. People knew better than to push back. People knew better than to resist. But this time, power had underestimated the wrong woman. What the arrogant executives didn't realize was that she wasn't there to blend in. She wasn't there just to learn. She wasn't there just to take notes and obey. She was there to uncover the rot they had spent years hiding, the corruption buried beneath polite smiles, the discrimination disguised as company policy, the systemic injustice that had ruined lives and careers for generations. And with every careless remark, every smirk, every whispered insult they thought she was too small to hear, the clock ticked closer to the moment she would strike back. This was not just an internship. It was an investigation. This was not just another employee. It was the daughter of a man whose power they could not fathom, a black CEO who had built his empire against all odds. And this young woman, who they dismissed as a nobody, would one day hold the pen that signed their downfall. But before that moment of reckoning, there would be struggle. Pain. Injustice that would make you question how far people will go to keep their power. She would be tested, humiliated, and pushed to the very edge of silence. Yet the silence would not hold forever. Because the truth, once uncovered, cannot be buried again. So the question remains, what happens when the people who believe they are untouchable are suddenly exposed by the very intern they thought they could control? The answer is a story you won't forget. Before she ever set foot inside the skyscraper's polished lobby, before the whispers and stares and cutting remarks, she lived a life most people thought was perfect. To the outside world, she was the daughter of a man who had climbed higher than anyone thought possible, a black CEO whose very presence at the head of a multi-billion-dollar company defied history. People assumed her life was lined with comfort, doors opening effortlessly before her, every path cleared of struggle. But the truth was far more complicated. She had grown up not in the spotlight of her father's success, but in the shadow of his battles. She remembered the late nights when he came home, weary-eyed but unbroken, carrying the weight of boardroom wars fought not only with numbers but with prejudice. He never boasted about victories. He never complained about defeats. But she learned to read his silences, the way his jaw clenched when another partner underestimated him, the way his voice steadied when someone tried to strip him of credit he had earned 10 times over. From him, she learned resilience. From watching him, she absorbed the quiet art of listening more than speaking, of observing the spaces where truth slipped between words. She carried those lessons like armor, not for admiration but for survival. Because even though her family lived in comfort, she knew the world never truly saw her as equal. Her decision to take an internship at one of the company's subsidiaries, without revealing her last name, wasn't a whim. It was deliberate. She wanted to see what it meant to walk through those hallways without the shield of her father's reputation. She wanted to experience, firsthand, what young black professionals faced when stripped of any privilege her name might carry. She wanted to understand the truth, not the polished version written in glossy company reports. The day before her internship began, she sat at her desk at home, a modest wooden table cluttered with notes and books. On the surface, she was preparing like any eager graduate, brushing up on corporate culture, reading case studies, planning to impress. But beneath the neat stacks of paper, there was a simmering determination. She wasn't just preparing to work. She was preparing to see. Because she had already heard the stories, the hushed voices of young professionals who had been sidelined, the whispers about promotions handed to less qualified colleagues, the unspoken but ever-present weight of discrimination that lived in the corners of every room. She knew these weren't just isolated complaints. They were patterns. They were warnings. And still, she went. On the morning of her first day, the city was alive with motion. Buses hissing to a stop, the hum of traffic blending into a restless rhythm. She walked with steady steps, her hair pulled back neatly, her clothes chosen carefully to balance professionalism with humility. She wanted no assumptions of privilege, no glances that connected her to her father's name. She was determined to start at the ground level, invisible, unnoticed. Yet even in her quiet walk, tension trailed her. She knew she was stepping into a world where her skin would speak before her voice did. Where her worth would be judged not by what she brought to the table, but by assumptions that followed her like shadows. Inside the lobby, the building gleamed with polished stone and mirrored walls. People moved with purpose, badges swinging from lanyards, voices clipped and efficient. To her, it felt like entering a theater, each person rehearsing their role, some as leaders, some as followers, some as the overlooked extras who kept the stage running. She was content to play the role of an unnoticed extra. At least for now. Her first introductions were polite, almost too polite. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Handshakes that lingered a beat too short. She felt the weight of unspoken judgment pressing in. Was it her age? Her gender? Or something else that made them glance twice before turning away? She couldn't be sure. But the unease in the air was unmistakable. Over the first few days, she noticed more than she was meant to. She noticed how certain names in meetings carried weight while others were brushed aside. She noticed who was interrupted, who was spoken over, who was credited for ideas that weren't theirs. She noticed the laughter that followed certain jokes, the kind of laughter that cuts deeper than words. And she noticed how those who endured it most often looked like her. This was not a company fueled by innovation and equal opportunity, as its glossy brochures proclaimed. This was a company built on silent hierarchies, on unwritten rules that kept power concentrated at the top, with little room for anyone who didn't fit the image of authority the executives had quietly agreed upon. Still, she kept her composure. She took notes. She asked questions. She smiled when expected. But behind the calm surface, her mind was already mapping out the patterns, drawing lines between what was said and what was left unsaid. Every interaction became a piece of evidence, every small act of bias another thread in a growing web. Her plan had been simple: observe, learn, and walk away with insight. But what she was uncovering went beyond what she had expected. The injustice wasn't subtle. It wasn't accidental. It was systematic, deliberate, and woven into the very fabric of how the office operated. And she couldn't unsee it. Each day chipped away at the illusion that this internship was just another stepping stone. With every encounter, the tension deepened, pulling her closer to a line she hadn't expected to cross. She began to realize she wasn't just gathering insight. She was being pulled into a story of exploitation and corruption that demanded more than silence. Something was building. She could feel it in the way her chest tightened when she heard another cruel remark, in the way her hands trembled slightly when she stayed silent during a meeting that screamed with unfairness. She was here to witness. But how long could she witness without acting? The world around her still thought she was just an intern. Just another face in the crowd. But within her, a storm was rising, and when it broke, nothing in that building would remain untouched. The first week passed with polite masks and quiet observation. By the second, the masks began to crack. It started with small things. In meetings, when she raised her hand with a point carefully thought through, the conversation would flow right past her as if she hadn't spoken. Minutes later, the same idea would resurface from another intern, a young man with less preparation, and suddenly the room would nod with approval. She forced herself to smile, to act as though it didn't sting. But inside, something tightened, each dismissal carving into her like a blade too dull to kill but sharp enough to wound. Then came the assignments. While her peers were trusted with projects that offered visibility, client presentations, research with executives, she was handed tasks designed to keep her in the shadows. Organizing files. Fetching data no one would use. Busy work disguised as opportunity. She worked diligently anyway, because she knew she was being tested. Yet the quiet humiliation lingered. The comments soon followed. Not loud enough for a formal complaint, but clear enough to pierce through. "She's so articulate," one manager whispered, as though surprised. "Maybe she's a diversity hire," another chuckled when they thought she was out of earshot. Each word was poison. Each glance was a reminder that no matter how capable she was, they had already written her story, a box she would never escape in their eyes. But she listened. She observed. And she waited. The turning point came during a team presentation. She had spent late nights refining the numbers, ensuring the analysis was bulletproof. It was her work that formed the backbone of the report, her insight that could steer the project forward. But when the day came to present, her supervisor casually announced, "We'll let Daniel handle this." Daniel, the same intern who had borrowed her ideas only weeks earlier, now stood at the front of the room basking in praise for research he barely understood. She sat in silence, watching her work paraded around the conference table, the executives nodding with approval. Her fists curled beneath the desk, nails biting into her palms. Rage swelled in her chest, but she swallowed it down. Because silence, for now, was power. Yet the silence could not last forever. By the third week, patterns emerged that could no longer be ignored. Black employees, she noticed, were nearly absent from leadership positions. Those who were there carried themselves with the careful caution of people who knew one wrong step could cost them everything. Others simply disappeared, their names fading from the directory with no explanation. Promotions seemed to skip over them like stones skimming across water, never sinking, never settling. And still, the jokes persisted. The smirks. The whispers. One afternoon, in the break room, she overheard two managers laughing over coffee. "Funny how she thinks she belongs here," one muttered. The other snorted. "Don't worry. Interns like her don't last long." The words froze her in place. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like the walls themselves could hear. She slipped out before they noticed, the sting of humiliation burning hotter than ever. That night, she sat at her desk in the small apartment she rented for the internship, staring at her notes. Every slight, every insult, every stolen idea, it was all there, neatly recorded. What had begun as quiet observation was becoming a dossier, a map of corruption threaded with discrimination. And still, she hadn't revealed who she was. To them, she remained just another faceless intern. But the facade was beginning to crack. The more she saw, the harder it became to stay silent. Especially when the injustice was not only directed at her. She witnessed colleagues, hardworking, brilliant young black employees, denied credit, passed over for opportunities, and treated like they were invisible. She saw the way their shoulders slumped after yet another dismissal, the way they smiled to mask disappointment, the way they carried wounds too familiar to name. Her silence was no longer just about protecting herself. It was about protecting them. The moment of no return came during a quarterly meeting. The executives filled the room, smug in their power, their voices filling the air with polished words that masked ugly truths. She sat in the back, her notebook open, her eyes fixed on the men who had turned the company into a machine that chewed up lives. One executive, the very same who had dismissed her ideas, leaned back in his chair and joked about culture fit when discussing potential hires. The laughter that followed was cold, sharp, and cruel. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. This wasn't just injustice. This was corruption. This was rot. And she was sitting in the middle of it, holding more evidence than they realized. She left the meeting with her hands trembling, her pulse racing. The storm inside her had grown too large to contain. She knew what she had to do. But here's the question, how do you expose corruption in a place where power protects itself? How do you challenge an empire that has silenced voices far stronger than yours? Her answer was simple, you strike when they least expect it. And as she walked out of the building that evening, the city lights reflecting against the glass towers above her, she knew the day was coming soon. The day she would stop being silent. The day the intern would reveal who she truly was. The storm she had been holding back finally arrived on the day of the quarterly review, the meeting where every department head would gather, and every intern would be expected to fade quietly into the background. The air in the boardroom was sharp with tension. Executives shuffled papers, clicked their pens, and spoke with the smug certainty of people who believed their power was untouchable. The long glass table reflected their polished suits, their practiced smiles, their careful performance of authority. She sat at the far end, notebook open, pen steady, heart racing. Today was supposed to be just another meeting. But today, they went too far. The first department head began his presentation, full of graphs and numbers she knew had been manipulated to cover failures. She had seen the raw data herself. She knew the truth. But as he spoke, the executives nodded, satisfied, ready to move on. Lies passed as facts. Corruption masqueraded as competence. Then came the hiring discussion. A manager leaned back in his chair, smirk curling his lips, and said casually, "We've had too many diversity hires lately. It's starting to hurt the culture." The room laughed. Not the nervous kind of laughter that dies quickly, but the comfortable kind, the kind that reveals agreement. The kind that cuts deeper than a knife. She felt the blood rush to her ears. For a moment, the world blurred around her. Every slight, every insult, every stolen idea, every whisper that dismissed her worth came roaring back in that instant. Her father's battles. Her colleagues' silent suffering. Her own humiliation. It all converged into one burning truth: silence was no longer an option. Her hand trembled as she pushed her notebook aside. For the first time, she raised her voice. "Excuse me," she said, steady but sharp enough to slice through the laughter. The room froze. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, surprised that an intern had dared to interrupt. One executive arched a brow. "Yes? Do you have something to add?" She stood. Her legs shook, but her voice did not. "Yes," she said. "I do." What followed was not a speech she had prepared. It was a release: months of observation, weeks of injustice, years of unspoken truth pouring out in words sharp as fire. She laid out the data they had hidden, the bias they had normalized, the corruption they had dressed in polished suits. She spoke of employees whose voices were buried, whose careers were stolen, whose worth was trampled. Every sentence was a blade cutting through the illusion they had built. Every word echoed louder than the last. And still, they tried to silence her. "That's enough. You're out of line. You don't understand how business works." But she did not stop. Because she had not come to understand. She had come to expose. Finally, one of the senior executives slammed his palm against the table. His voice dripped with contempt. "You're just an intern. You don't belong in this conversation." The words hung in the air, heavy and brutal. But she smiled, calm, deliberate, unstoppable. "I suppose you're right," she said. "An intern doesn't belong here." She reached into her bag, pulled out a sleek black folder, and placed it on the table. The logo embossed on the front glinted under the fluorescent light, the unmistakable seal of the parent company, the empire her father had built. "I'm not here as an intern," she continued, her voice rising with every word. "I'm here as the daughter of the CEO. And I've been watching." The silence that followed was absolute. Shock rippled across the room. Faces paled. Pens dropped. The smirks vanished like smoke in a storm. She opened the folder. Inside were pages of notes, data, and testimony she had gathered over weeks, proof of their lies, their corruption, their discrimination. She slid it across the table. "Every word I've spoken is documented. Every name, every decision, every action. And my father will see it all." For the first time, fear replaced arrogance in their eyes. The executives who had laughed minutes earlier now sat frozen, powerless. She looked at them, each one who had dismissed her, humiliated her, stolen her work, and felt no fear. Only clarity. "You wanted to test me," she said softly, her words slicing sharper than a shout. "You wanted to see how far you could push someone who looked like me. Well, you've had your test. And you failed." The room remained silent. No one moved. No one dared. She gathered her things, her head high, her step steady, the storm now unleashed in full force. At the door, she paused, turned back, and delivered the line that would echo long after she was gone. "The intern you dismissed just fired you." She walked out, leaving a boardroom full of men and women who had built their empire on silence, now choking on their own fear. But this was not the end. This was only the beginning. Because exposing the truth inside that room was one thing. Changing the system outside of it would be another. And as she stepped into the hallway, her heart still pounding, one thought burned brighter than the rest. The fight had only just begun. The echoes of her words still lingered long after she walked out of that boardroom. Behind those glass doors, the empire of arrogance she had exposed sat in stunned silence. Outside, the city carried on, footsteps tapping against the pavement, horns blaring in traffic, people rushing between meetings unaware that, within those walls, something had just broken. For her, the storm had passed, but the weight of what she had unleashed pressed heavy on her shoulders. She hadn't just spoken for herself. She had spoken for every voice silenced before her. Every career cut short. Every black professional who had been told they didn't fit the culture. And though she had walked out victorious, she knew this was not the end of the story. Her father received the folder later that evening. She didn't need to hear his words to know the impact it carried. Years of corruption, prejudice, and injustice laid bare in black and white, a record no executive could spin or bury. For the men and women who had laughed so freely, the consequences were swift and brutal. Board seats dissolved. Contracts revoked. Careers that had been built on exploitation collapsed overnight. But even as the corrupt fell, she did not celebrate. Because she understood something deeper, removing a few corrupt faces was not the same as dismantling a corrupt system. Those men were symptoms. The disease that allowed them to thrive still lived in boardrooms, classrooms, and offices across the country. And that was the part that weighed on her most. She thought of the young interns who would come after her, the ones without a powerful name to shield them, without a father's empire to amplify their truth. What would happen to them if they dared to speak up? Would they be dismissed? Silenced? Destroyed? Her heart tightened at the thought. She had been able to walk away with her head high, but how many others had walked away broken? How many had swallowed their rage because they knew they could not afford to lose everything? That realization became her turning point. From that day on, she refused to let her story remain only her own. She began to share it, first in quiet conversations, then on public platforms, and eventually on stages filled with young professionals who carried the same scars she had once hidden. She spoke not as the daughter of a CEO, but as a black woman who had seen the truth behind polished glass walls. She reminded them that silence was not survival. That their worth was not defined by dismissive smirks or stolen credit. That their presence in those rooms was not a favor, but a right earned through brilliance and resilience. And slowly, she saw change ripple outward. Companies forced to reckon with uncomfortable truths. Young employees emboldened to document, to speak, to demand. The same system that had thrived in secrecy now trembled under the weight of exposure. Her story did not end with the firing of corrupt bosses. It grew into something larger, a movement of accountability. But even as victories came, she remained clear-eyed. For every boardroom that crumbled, another stood untouched. For every executive exposed, another remained hidden. The struggle was not over. It might never be over in her lifetime. And yet, she fought anyway. Because every fight mattered. Every story mattered. Every voice raised against injustice chipped away at the walls built to silence them. Her journey taught her that racism in the workplace is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, disguised in compliments that cut deep, in opportunities withheld, in jokes that seem harmless until you realize the weight they carry. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, thriving on the silence of those who see it but choose not to act. And so, the question she carried, the question she left with every person who heard her story, was this. How long will we allow silence to protect the corrupt? The boardroom she walked out of was only one story. But how many more exist? How many voices are still being silenced at this very moment? How many brilliant futures are being dimmed by systems that pretend to value diversity while quietly destroying it? These are not questions she could answer alone. They are questions meant for all of us. Because the truth is, racism does not end when one boss is fired or one corrupt company falls. It ends when we choose to see, to speak, to act, not only for ourselves but for those who cannot. And so, she continues to walk into rooms where she is underestimated, continues to speak when silence would be easier, continues to fight when surrender would be safer. Not because it guarantees victory, but because every act of resistance lights the path for someone else. Her story is not just about exposure. It is about courage. It is about refusing to let injustice remain invisible. It is about turning the pain of silence into the power of truth. And as her voice spread, one truth became undeniable. The intern they dismissed became the voice they could no longer ignore. So now, the question turns to you, the one watching, listening, carrying this story forward. When you see injustice, will you look away? Or will you speak, even when your voice trembles? Because silence protects no one but the guilty. And sometimes, all it takes is one voice, steady, unshaken, unafraid, to bring down the walls built to keep us silent.